All right. So as we started planning this this forum, we reached out to the collaboratives and asked them, what was this something that you would like to see? What would bring you to Laramie for 3 days and leave you feeling like you really accomplished something? And one of the things that we heard time after time after time is, man, I wish I knew more about NEPA. So we looked around and did some research and found an amazing expert who actually lives in Cody. So Rebecca Watson is joining us all the way from Cody, Wyoming, and she is going to talk to us about the NEPA process.
All right, well, great to be here. And I want to just share where I'm coming from so you kind of know what informs this conversation today. I've been a lawyer in private practice for about 40 years and really focused on federal land management and energy. And I've worked in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and Washington, D.C. as a private law firm lawyer, helping clients permit projects, largely mining, oil and gas, timber, solar, wind on federal land. So working my way through NEPA and federal environmental laws. I've also served as a federal policymaker. So I worked at the Department of Energy as a lawyer, where I really began to know and understand federal environmental law. And then most recently as the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals at the Department of Interior over the Bureau of Land Management, Office of Surface Mining, and what was then Minerals Management Service, or offshore oil and gas. And then lastly, I've done what you guys have done. When I came out of the government, we moved to Denver, Colorado, and I got involved on the Continental Divide Trail Alliance board, serving as their president, and then working with an incredible stewardship organization called Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado, which has been in place for over 35 years, works with federal, state, and local partners to put stewards on the ground to build trails, maintain sites, recover from floods and fire. And then the last organization was the Jefferson County Open Space. And this was, Jefferson County is the closest county to Denver. It's in the foothills of Denver, and it has an amazing system of parks and open space that people, like 40 years ago, taxed themselves, put a bond out so they could raise money to purchase land before it was all gone, preserving things like the mountain front and places for people to recreate. And as you can imagine, being so close to Denver and with Denver's growth, that park was hit with a lot of user conflicts and impact. So I've learned a lot from those experiences. Oh, okay. I think we're good. We're good. All right, we're good.
This is not.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yay. Technology, always a challenge. So Wyoming is known around the world. We have our amazing megafauna, grizzly bear number 399 and her prolific reproduction rate with her 4 cubs, Yellowstone, Old Faithful, and then just our wildlife and wide open spaces. And that attracts people to the state to enjoy these opportunities that really are pretty unique to Wyoming. And a lot of those activities are on federal lands. And what I want to talk about first before we dive into NEPA is, what are these resources in Wyoming that you might want to develop infrastructure on and that would trigger NEPA? And so we're going to take a look at 5 federal agencies that operate in the state of Wyoming, some cross-cutting environmental laws, and look at the recent congressional support for outdoor recreation. And then we're going to talk about navigating NEPA. So Congress has, through a variety of laws, established outdoor recreation as a mission of these 7 federal agencies. Oh, thank you. I need all the help I can get from out there. So these are the 7 agencies. We don't have the U.S. Army Corps dams here in Wyoming, nor do we have obviously national marine sanctuary areas. But amazingly enough, those 2 agencies actually get a lot more visitors than do the national parks. So not to be ignored when you think about outdoor recreation. I've given a little squib here of the laws that Congress passed for these particular agencies, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. And the reason why I'm starting with this is because the first way to have success with NEPA is to know and understand the agency you're dealing with. The federal government isn't a monolith. These agencies operate under specific statutes with specific authority, rulemakings, and because of that, they've developed their own culture. And I didn't appreciate that as a person on the outside until I went into the Department of Interior, where most of these agencies are found, and observed the different cultural and folk ways of these agencies. They're different, and you're not going to be able to successfully communicate in the NEPA process unless you appreciate those differences. So that's what I'm trying to do in the first half of this is introduce you to that. The Forest Service is the only agency that's not in the Department of Interior that I'm going to talk about today. And that may seem obvious to us in the room, but I can't tell you how many times that my Secretary of Interior was asked about the Forest Service and how she was managing the forest land. And it's like, no, the Forest Service is not in Interior, it's at the Department of Agriculture. This map kind of gives you a big picture overview of how the forests and the grasslands are found across the state of Wyoming. So a pretty big footprint. The Forest Service actually originally was in the Department of Interior in 1891. And you might remember your history that President Theodore Roosevelt was the first one to establish what were called forest reserves. And these lands were pulled out of the public domain, and they were set aside to protect and manage timber and water sources. And that birth, if you will, of the Forest Service is very important to their culture, particularly when they contrast themselves to the BLM and others. Recreation has always been an important part of the Forest Service. 1919 was when their first recreation official was hired by the Forest, so very early in their history. And in the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, recreation is listed as the first multiple use. So it's an important part of the Forest Service. I would say the Forest Service is a little bit different. You see some of the authorities there. They have the authority to construct hotels and resorts. So a little more infrastructure than you might find on Bureau of Land Management land. But like the Bureau of Land Management, they're a multiple use agency and they balance competing uses. You may be hiking your trail and there's cattle up there grazing and it gets kind of smelly. So, I mean, that's part of what multiple use is all about. And the other feature that BLM and Forest Service share is dispersed recreation. You're kind of a little bit more on your own than you are in some other agencies. Now, the Forest Service, I heard some guy yesterday say that the Forest Service managed the most land. No, sorry, the BLM does, but I'll let it slide. I didn't call them out on it. But the Forest Service does manage 193 million acres, about 8.5% of the US. And I've tried to put these, I don't know, how do I keep this lit up when I'm talking too long? Never mind, I figured it out. Okay, so I try to find vision statements because, again, this statement of what their recreation vision is gives you clues about what's important to them. And they talk about their treasured lands, the idea of fostering a connection to the land and the natural world, but then this idea of stewardship. So that's important to understand what their vision is. Now, this gives you a snapshot of what the forest has in Wyoming: 6 national forests plus parts of 3. This is a very jumpy thing. So anyway, and they manage everything from wilderness to very developed ski areas. And they have the grasslands, which provides for a lot of different recreation and a national recreation area based around water. So a variety of things. So this Bureau of Land Management is the next multiple use agency. And as I said, it manages the most federal land of any land manager. And it manages most, a large part of Wyoming, over half of Wyoming surface, and then about 60% of the minerals in the state. BLM is the agency that manages all federal minerals, no matter what federal surface or fee surface they're under. So BLM has a big job in that regard. Now, BLM, unlike the Forest Service, was created out of the lands that were kind of left over from the homestead area. So the BLM was created really in 1946 out of the 1812 General Land Office, which 1812, so back in the early days, after the revolution was run, the federal government gave land to the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War. So BLM descends from that organization and the Grazing Service. Now, so this kind of history has, earned BLM some derision and negativity from people on the outside. Oh, they just have the leftover lands. The Bureau of Logging and Mining, saying, oh, they're just a commodity organization. But they have a very complicated role in managing these public land uses. And the Supreme Court, in a recent decision in the early 2000s, talked about the very complicated task of balancing all the multiple uses that the statute that they operate under directs them to manage. So the other fact is that BLM has some of the most amazing opportunities for dispersed recreation. You can encounter nature on your own terms better on BLM land than other lands. So we give a shout out to BLM. So the Federal Land and Policy Management Act came into place in 1976, and that is what's called BLM's Organic Act. This is really where BLM, as the modern BLM that we know, was born. And this was a result of an enormous congressional process of planning and thinking and reports about how to manage these lands. And they came to the decision, we're done with getting rid of lands. We are going to retain those lands and manage them for multiple uses. So recreation is one of BLM's 6 principal and exclusive multiple uses. And the statute defines it as such, as principal and exclusive, and recreation is in there. BLM manages 248 million acres, over 10% of the United States surface, and generates much less than the Forest Service does. Forest Service was about 225 million, and the BLM only $77 million per year from outdoor recreation. And again, I think that reflects that it is largely undeveloped forms of recreation on BLM land. Now, their strategy, as a person having worked with BLM, I think it reflects what that agency prides itself on, and that is being close to the communities they work in. Their field offices are in smaller communities. They're part of the community. Their kids play on the softball teams. They meet up with people in the grocery store. They're close to the ground, and that's a point of pride for BLM. So you see that in their recreation strategy, connecting with communities. But the other factor is preserving that character of the public land setting, the undeveloped nature of BLM lands when it comes to recreation infrastructure. So BLM has a variety of options that you can pursue, but I just want to highlight this one special category, national conservation areas. The BLM, as I said, the Bureau of Logging and Mining, well, FLPMA always had in it conservation, wildlife, concerns for water, for archaeological and cultural resources. In the Clinton administration, they wanted to elevate those conservation purposes created the National Conservation Areas. It was then authorized by Congress. So it's a kind of a new thing, 2009, but this is where you'll find wilderness study areas and other areas with special features that are protected under this system. So Fish and Wildlife Service is the next agency. And now we turn away from multiple use. Now the next two agencies I'm going to talk about, their focus is different, and Congress has defined it differently. Again, our friend Theodore Roosevelt created these wildlife refuges. Then birds were being slaughtered at a great rate for ladies' hats and for food. And so he created refuges, the first one in Florida, to protect birds and their habitat. And that has then gone on to become the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so their recreation is narrowed by statute. It can only be recreation that is compatible with wildlife. So their primary mission is conserving the wildlife in their particular refuge. And you can have recreation, but only so long as it's compatible. And the statute goes so far as to list the compatible uses. So it's important. Fish and Wildlife Service manages about 4% of the United States, 89 million acres. And look at how much money they make from outdoor recreation on their lands. $1.3 billion, significantly more than either the Forest Service or BLM. And their recreation strategy reflects their statute. Recreational opportunities consistent with their conservation mission. So Wyoming has 7 wildlife refuges, the more widely known, the National Elk Refuge, but then there's several refuges located around the Green River and the Platte River, water-based refuges that are available for the compatible recreational uses we talked about. So, okay, now we come to the National Park Service, and this is the big dog, the kahuna. This agency dominates inside Maine Interior. They get most of Interior's budget, and they have a lot of authority. People would always remark on the fact that the Park Service has some kind of park facility, whether it's a historic site or a park, in every single congressional district in the US. So they have their own political power, and they use it. And the other thing is, National Park Service is called one of our best ideas. Ken Burns has done a film on it. So the Park Service, has a lot of attention and a lot of focus, and you'll see that in some of the other things that I point out. Obviously, the Park Service does not have a multiple use mission. It doesn't have exactly a conservation mission, but it has a mission that's dual purpose, that is challenging. And that is both to provide enjoyment to people, but then to preserve the land unimpaired for future generations. So what do you allow? What might impair the park for future generations? What's okay to do to provide people with enjoyment? That's why they have to debate about, e-bikes and whether you can, put infrastructure for climbing in parks. That's the question they're asking themselves. Where does it fall on this balance that we're required by statute to protect? And I thought their recreation strategy is very revealing of this. They talk about, let's enjoy these park resources, but we need to preserve them for future generations. That's their dual purpose. But then they end with 3 times: protect, protect, protect. So that, to me, okay, so I'm a BLM fan, so Park Service, I give them the shade sometimes, but that's their culture, and it's worth knowing. So National Park Service, we all know the big major parks, Devil's Tower, but there's also, like, one of my favorite places is Fort Laramie, that historic site. I still remember taking my dad there from the Midwest and enjoying the living history and learning so much about that time period he was fascinated by. We also have all these amazing historic trails that traverse through Wyoming that the Park Service manages in all or part. And then they also have something that I appreciate living up in Cody is the Bighorn Canyon. That is phenomenal. I mean, it's technically in Montana, but the headquarters are in Lovell, Wyoming, and it's a phenomenal canyon and place to water recreate. The next agency is not one you really think about. They're not a land management agency. This is the Bureau of Reclamation, but they do provide a heck of a lot of recreation throughout the United States and in Wyoming. And so they were developed to provide water, to build big impoundments, provide water and hydropower. So that's their mission. And they're located mainly in 17 states, Western states. You see there 1 in 5 Western farmers get water from a Bureau of Reclamation project. Up there in Cody, we've got our big Shoshone Dam, the Buffalo Bill Reservoir that allowed the whole area of Cody and Powell to even exist. And as early as 1902, when the Bureau of Reclamation was started, they highlighted recreation as a project purpose. So recreation was always contemplated, even though this was a kind of an industrial agency. And the other thing that's unique about the Bureau of Reclamation, that could be something that would be nice to see adopted elsewhere, but their statute allows the Bureau of Reclamation to work in partnership with state, local, and other federal agencies to manage recreation on their site. So they can offload their recreation management responsibilities to other governments. And that can be a very positive thing. And you see that on this slide about how they manage recreation in Wyoming. We have 19 reservoirs in multiple state, local, even Natrona County Roads is managing one of these recreation sites on these reservoirs. So it provides some flexibility and local input that's unique compared to any others. Now there's a couple of important recreation laws that apply across lands. And one is Wilderness Act of 1964. That was really the first modern environmental law enacted, was the Wilderness Act. That restricts recreation on wilderness. It can only be of a primitive type, non-motorized. Wild and Scenic Rivers Act followed in 68, and that protected free-flowing rivers for 3 different purposes, including recreation. Here in Wyoming, we only have 2 stretches of river that are included in Wild and Scenic, and oddly enough, I actually played a role in the Clark's Fork designation, which was the first river to be designated. Up in Cody country, I was representing a client who had property adjacent to the river. And we worked with Senator Malcolm Wallop to get this put in place for the first time in Wyoming. The other we've already come across on some of the lands, the National Trail System Act. This is designating different kinds of trails, national scenic trails, national historic trails, Rails for Trail program. So this is the authority that applies across land management agencies. So I just want to highlight this fact. We've talked about some of the money, and I want to go through this kind of quickly, but there has been an increased focus and support in Congress for outdoor recreation, and it's still ongoing. I would like to call your attention to what I think is one of the most important acts, and that is the Rec Act of 2016. Senator Cory Gardner from Colorado was instrumental in getting this bill put in place. And what that did was have transparency. How much does outdoor recreation contribute to our economy? And it was mind-blowing. People had no idea how much it contributed. There were outside people trying to highlight that, but this is now the Bureau of Economic Affairs or something. I forget that their agency name, but official statistics, and they come out every year, and it's very important. Now, we've heard about the Land and Water Conservation Act, but recent legislation did 2 important things. In 2019, in the Dingle Act, the LWCF was made permanent. It was at its end of its statutory life, 50 years. And there was a debate. Should it be made permanent? Should it just get another term? Well, it was made permanent in 2019. And even more important, in 2020, the LWCF spending was made mandatory. The statute authorizes $900 million per year from oil and gas receipts offshore, but Congress would never appropriate all of it. The most they would appropriate would be about half, 400,000 or so. So that was a huge win. And the Dingell Act also did a lot of designations of new wilderness, other recreation areas. It was one of those omnibus bills that has had a lot of separate bills that were all lumped into one, and it was a huge win for outdoor recreation. In 2020, in the Great American Outdoors Act, there was a focus on this deferred maintenance problem. You may hear about that. Agencies say, oh, we've got this deferred maintenance, we can never catch up. And this legislation looked to onshore oil and gas and renewable energy and taking those royalties or fees that they have to pay for 5 years and devoting them to solve or cut down the deferred maintenance. Well, you see here, when I talk about the big dog, National Park Service, they get 70% of it. And here's BLM and Forest and Fish and Wildlife Service, they get 5%, and Forest Service 15%. What I thought was the most interesting thing, and it's worth knowing, is that most of this deferred maintenance is roads. So 83% of BLM's deferred maintenance is for road repair. Park Service is a little less, 46%, but then you have to think about what the Park Service manages. A lot of old houses and buildings that also constantly require maintenance. And Forest Service, 68% of their deferred maintenance budget is roads, so access. And then in 2021, American Rescue Plan gave money for outdoor recreation. 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill, more money for recreation. 2022, an important MAP lands acts on helping to increase access, something that a lot of Western senators are concerned about. And then 2022, more money in the Inflation Reduction Act. So somebody said, you know, we're like drowning in money from the federal government, and that this is part of it. So there's other programs I won't talk about, but I'm just going to talk about this Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Act. This is one of the oldest programs providing funding for outdoor recreation. We heard Dave talk about that on Wednesday, the opening talk, in fact, about where all this money comes from. And this is the self-imposed excise tax on hunters and fishers' equipment that they pour right back into habitat and wildlife for the species that they hunt and fish. For example, Wyoming Game and Fish, look how much of their budget comes from this, 22%. So it's significant money. Now, the bad news is we've got some folks, including Representative Rosendale from Montana, who are advocating to get rid of the Pittman-Robertson Act as some sort of violation of the Second Amendment. He has put forward a repeal act, and then there is, or return, I guess it's called. And then just this week, he announced yet another initiative, and that is to not allow the LWCF money that goes towards federal land acquisition to be spent. So I don't think they stand much success in getting passed, but they are worth watching because these two programs are fundamental to outdoor recreation. So changes on the horizon, Senator Barrasso, Senator Manchin have this American Outdoors Recreation Act. And really, this is a lot of legislation that was moving at the same time as was the Great Outdoors Act, but they couldn't get it over the finish line. So they focused in on what they could in 2020. I think there's a lot of support for this legislation. Again, it's always a matter of the calendar and time and other priorities. But that's a very positive bill. And then the last few items I'm talking about here, the 30 by 30 America the Beautiful, the BLM conservation rule that was just put out for comment on April 1st, the U.S. Forest Service and BLM mature and old growth forest announcement of proposed rulemaking that came out last week, and then the BLM Greater Sage Grouse Resource Management Plans that are expected sometime later this year. All these are about conservation, protecting land, and members of the outdoor recreation community have raised concerns. Where does outdoor recreation fit in these conservation initiatives? So again, something to be aware of and participate in. You have ability to participate. So now we know why we might want to be doing NEPA. So we'll take a look at NEPA and the context for NEPA. And it's good to remember because we're talking about Earth Day some 40 years ago or something. 1969, Apollo 8 was up there going to the moon. It took the first pictures of planet Earth in space, the great blue ball. Santa Barbara oil spill happened in 69. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio was burning on fire in 69. So there was a great concern about the environment, and the NEPA legislation was moving through Congress in 89. President Nixon was the president at the time, and I found this statement from him, and I think it's just interesting to reflect on this. In February 1970, he said, "We need fundamentally new philosophies of land, air, and water use, stricter regulation, expanded government action for greater citizen involvement, and new programs." And that statement was preparatory to he had like, I don't know, a 40-point plan for the environment. And of course, he signed the National Environmental Policy Act into law. The environment at that time was a bipartisan good thing. And he also signed the Clean Water Act and several other early environmental laws into place. So NEPA is an unusual law from a lawyer's perspective. It's very short. It's like 6 pages. And it's aspirational. It uses kind of highfalutin, tug at your heartstrings language, talking about productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. And it also, it set this target, this aspirational goal, and it also created an agency, the Council of Environmental Quality, CEQ, which is part of the White House. And that is the agency that promulgates NEPA regulations, further defines it, puts out guidance and policy. It's very critical. It's given a lot of deference by federal courts. When it says this is the way we interpret NEPA, courts pay attention to it. Now, you notice I put a question mark in the title up there, National Environmental P ? And that's because there's a lot of misconception about NEPA. NEPA is not the National Environmental Protection Act. It's the Policy Act. And NEPA is fundamentally, and this is the key point about NEPA, it is a process. It is a procedure. NEPA does not tell you what you can't do or you can do. It just tries to inform agency decisions. And so federal agencies have to take a hard look at the environmental impacts of the decisions they make. And NEPA is the way that they take that hard look. So I'm going to hit what I think are 6 key points. As you'll learn later, NEPA is a court-made law. Most of NEPA is not in the statutes, have been fleshed out by court decisions. It's complicated. You have to know a lot. But I think there's 6 key points that maybe would be helpful to you in what you do. Starting off with the first one that I just said, NEPA is procedural, not substantive. Now, I wanted to quote this court decision because it really sums it up in strong language. And that is that NEPA doesn't mandate particular results. The federal agency can decide that other values outweigh environmental values. NEPA only prohibits uninformed rather than unwise decisions. The agency can make an unwise decision. They can decide, well, something else is more important than this particular wetland or whatever. And that's all right with NEPA because NEPA doesn't tell you what to do. It's a process that you go through. It's a disclosure process. It discloses information to the agency, but then more importantly to the public and other people involved in the decision. And this Metal Valley case was a recreation case decided in the context somebody wanted to build a big new ski area in the state of Washington. Second thing, NEPA is triggered by federal action. Some states do have mini NEPAs. California and Montana have their own NEPA statutes, different than the NEPA, but inspired by it. But it takes federal money, federal action, even if it's a federal decision on a private project that triggers NEPA. The other important thing is it's a federal agency obligation. You hear a lot of developers complaining about NEPA, the process. Well, you know, if you're developing a project, a commodity use, typically you have to pay for the NEPA. And you also have the ability under NEPA to do applicant prepared environmental assessments, the second level of NEPA review. But in the end, it comes right back to the federal agency's desk. Nobody else can make that decision. The federal agency has to approve the NEPA document, and based on that NEPA document, make a decision. So it's a federal agency obligation. And then it's a public process. And that was kind of unique. You know, we think back again, President Nixon talking about greater public involvement. Think about how our government was started out in the progressive era, was the idea that we have experts in these agencies and they're educated and have experience and they're making the decisions. There wasn't much opportunity for public involvement. NEPA changed that and made these decisions open to public comment. So that's a very important value that is embedded into NEPA. Then NEPA can act as an umbrella statute. So if you have some kind of federal involvement, it's not going to just trigger NEPA. You're going to have to comply with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Historic Preservation Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Endangered Species Act, Bald and Gold Legal Protection Act, all these other laws that have their own processes. These are most of them are substantive laws, but the National Historic Preservation Act is like NEPA in that it's a process. But you have all these things you have to comply with and get these permits, and they all kind of have to dovetail and end up at the end at around the same time, ideally. So NEPA can function as an umbrella and coordinate those other agency reviews. The regulations encourage agencies to use NEPA in that fashion. Is it always used this way? No. Is it a good thing if it was? Yes. But and then the last point, which I alluded to, is it's a judicially enforced statute. NEPA was very skinny. It was completely fleshed out by court decisions and early court challenges, and is continuing to evolve under those court challenges. And then I want to go back to that Metal Valley. One of the things about the NEPA process, I mean, the NEPA process can be used for good, but it can be used also, one might say, for evil. I don't know. I'll say that given who I represent. And this is the concept of you can win even if you lose. So NEPA adds delay. It delays your project, and time is money. If you're a small oil and gas company, you've got investors that gave you money. They want results. They want turnaround a certain amount of time. If you get bogged down in NEPA litigation, you lose that window and your project can go away. And so that is an important part of NEPA. That's NEPA strategy that is used. Everybody knows that this can work. So it's just something to be aware of, that NEPA, even if they lose, because guess what happened in Metal Valley? They won this important Supreme Court case, important law that we still follow to this day. But that ski area was never built. It never happened. So they won by losing. So this is typically where you run into NEPA, big picture planning decisions. All of these federal agencies do land use plans, and these are so important. And people don't participate enough in these, because these plans set the guideposts within which project-based decisions can occur. They decide what lands are off limits because they're protecting a certain resource. There's so many important decisions that are made at the planning stage. You heard the Forest Service recreation person talking about working on this plan that they hadn't amended the plan in 35 years. That's mind blowing. But, they are supposed to last for 10 to 15 years. But those opportunities when there's a plan out there or a plan amendment are really important for recreational community, because recreation, as you can see, is just really kind of coming into its own in these federal agencies. Even though they've had this authority for a long time, other things have taken priority. So your voices need to be part of that process so they know and understand what areas, what activities are important to you at the planning stage. And then you have project specific decisions, practically most of what you're dealing with. So the big question in NEPA, and this is where it's going to get more technical. So I'm trying to boil it down, because NEPA is frustrating in some ways because it isn't black letter law. Again, it doesn't tell you what to do or not do. So NEPA, the statute, talks about requiring a detailed statement for major federal actions that significantly affect the environment. Well, what does that mean? And this is the question that has to be answered by federal agencies when they decide what level of NEPA is compliant. And it's challenging. So major federal action significantly are terms of art. That means they're kind of fleshed out in court decisions. They are a little bit loosey-goosey. CEQ, okay, this just gives you an example of how crazy it is. What is a major action? It's one with significant impacts. Okay, that doesn't answer anything, but that's what we get in this case. So, but that is the important question that has to be answered in NEPA. What is there a significant impact? If there is significant impacts, then you have to do this environmental impact statement. It's the most rigorous. It has the most public participation. It's the most costly. It's the most time consuming. So that's an EIS. And if you look at that little blue chart, you can kind of get a sketch of how many of each of these documents are used on a yearly basis. So not many EISs. An environmental assessment with a finding of no significance, or FONSI, EA FONSI is how it's referred to, is a second level of review. But you just don't walk in and do EA FONSI. You're doing it for a purpose. You're asking the question, are there significant impacts? And so you're going through analysis. And if there are significant impacts, then you go back and do your environmental impact statement. An important part of an EA, and this is important for your project, is you can mitigate. So say there are some significant impacts to a cultural resource, an endangered species, or something like that. You can mitigate, you can modify your proposal, you can add in some compensatory mitigation to reduce the impact down below significance threshold and stay then under the EA FONSI umbrella, which is a good place to be. Now, the best place to be is categorical exclusion. That's the fastest and least expensive NEPA compliance. Now, again, in the popular world, this has a lot of misconceptions about it. Categorical exclusion. No, this is not excluded from NEPA. This is a NEPA compliance document. And there's a whole process that goes into creating and identifying a categorical exclusion. But basically, it encompasses actions that have been done over and over and over again. And every time the EA says finding of no significant impact. So rather than repeating that ad nauseum, they create a category, they define it, only these many acres, this aspect, that aspect. And then if your project or agency proposal complies with the terms of the categorical exclusion, then you are compliant with NEPA. Now, there's an important catch to that, if you will, or a safety valve, and that is a review of extraordinary circumstances. So are there some unique environmental concerns in this area, an endangered species habitat or something like that, that would caution you, it's not appropriate here to use that, we better go and use an EA. Then finally, another tool, it's not NEPA compliance, but it is a question that the Forest Service and the BLM can ask themselves before doing NEPA. And that is, have we already done NEPA that's adequate? Is our plan NEPA adequate to encompass this activity? Or is there another NEPA document that encompasses that activity? And so you might hear that term around DNA, and that's what that is. And then so you may appreciate having heard the explanation of these documents that are the culmination of the NEPA process, that significance is the key question. Does the action significantly affect the environment? And this quote resonates with me as a 40-year practitioner in NEPA. It says, courts, no less than agencies, find it trying or difficult to imbue this vague and amorphous term with a consistent and coherent definition. There is no good definition of significance. And that is one of the biggest struggles with NEPA, is that it is a subjective statute in many ways. You have the subjectivity of the agency officials deciding in their experience and knowledge, is this a significant impact that I should move up into an EIS? But you also have courts and project opponents who will have their own view. Well, you know, they kind of blew by this vole out there in Wyoming, and I think that's really important, and it should have been more adequately addressed. So that's the difficult part of NEPA, is that these terms that are in the statute are not well defined. There's not a clear boundary around them. Now, CEQ in regulations identified 10 factors that can help flesh out what is significant. And I'm not going to go through all these, but it gives you a flavor. You know, are there endangered species, national historic preservation? Is there a chance that law might be violated? All of these things, does it set a precedent? If you add this action to other actions that have already happened or are in the permitting process, will it have a cumulative impact that's significant? So these are all these kind of questions that agencies and courts ask themselves about the question of what level of documentation is required. So this is a decision tree, NEPA, and again, it shows you how these three documents work together. So you start out with your proposal. What's the key question in the second box? Are environmental effects likely to be significant? If you know the answer is yes, then you go down the EIS side, environmental impact statement, with its greater public participation, its greater document requirements. If you say no, there aren't significant impacts, then you can explore the categorical exclusion. Is there a categorical exclusion out there that I can use? But then, okay, you have to ask the question, second box down, are there extraordinary circumstances? If yes, boom, you're back into the environmental assessment lane, where you say, all right, I'm going to look and see what are these impacts? Are they significant? Can they be mitigated? If yes, you carry on down, you get to your decision. If not, you're going into the environmental impact statement phase. So this gives you just a rough idea of what the NEPA process is like. And as you can see from that first chart, EISs, they're for big actions. Your land use plans in BLM, a land use plan requires an environmental impact statement. Certain other things, if you're dealing with a big commodity type project, certain projects of a certain size will move into environmental impact statement. But there are not that many of them that are done. So you work through those in a coordinated fashion. So all NEPA documents are alike. If you've looked at them, you'll notice they're organized in a similar way. You start with the purpose and need. What is the purpose of this proposed action? What's the statutory authority for it? What's the need? And it can be an applicant proposal, but it also has to fit within, again, NEPA is the federal agency's responsibility, has to fit within their authority and what the land use plan says and things like that. And then you have your proposed action. It describes what the action is to construct 10 miles of trail in X spot. The key thing is the alternatives analysis. So again, you think about NEPA, it's a disclosure document. It's trying to give information to the federal decider and the public. So are there alternatives to it? Could you route this trail over here where maybe it avoids this cultural resource site, but oh, whoops, it gets close to a wetland. So you look at different alternatives. Again, if you're in an EIS, you're going to have to look at a lot more alternatives. EAs, less stringent. But note what CEQ says about alternatives. They're the heart of the NEPA analysis. And that's because it's only in comparing and contrasting and thinking of another way to do it that you might find ways to do it in a way that has less impact. Then the NEPA document will describe the affected environment. Where are we starting from? What's up there? What are all the resources that are on the land where this proposed project will go? And then the last chapter will be environmental effects. And this is very complicated because now you're looking at, okay, we're going to put the project down in this affected environment. And then we're going to think about what are its direct impacts, its indirect impacts, and its cumulative impacts. And we're going to do that for every alternative. So that's the complicated part of the NEPA, but that's where the money hits the road. That's really one of the most important parts of a NEPA document for people that are commenting on those documents. So where are your public opportunities to comment? Public notice of when NEPA is commencing. And sometimes, well, I mean, you can find them on the agency website. You can find it sometimes in newspapers, but the best place to find it is the Federal Register. Now, the Federal Register is sort of like the government's newspaper, where it publicizes the actions that require public notice. And there's a lot of them. Meetings of RAC committees, for example, have to be publicly noticed, and any kind of NEPA document. And that's a free subscription. I get it 6 days a week. I just go, I look at the Forest Service, I look at Interior, look at BLM, kind of see what's going on, and it's very quick. So, I mean, that's one way to do it. But having a close relationship with your agency where you're doing a project is the best way. You're hearing about it from the horse's mouth. Now, the scoping is the beginning of NEPA, and it's really a very important part of NEPA because this is the opportunity, the first opportunity for the public to provide input. It's an open-ended question. What are the issues we should be considering? What are the issues that really aren't important, that we don't have to spend our time on in NEPA? So getting involved at this early scoping stage is very important. And after scoping is done, a document is issued, the scoping report. And I'm more familiar with BLM, so I would just say the BLM makes it very easy to follow a NEPA process. They have a whole NEPA website, NEPA and planning website. You can go there, click on the left-hand side, get your documents. You can look at other people's comments. There's a lot of good information there that you can find. It's not the easiest. It's not like Google or something. It can be a little tricky, but it's there. And then the next opportunity is really at the draft document stage. So the agency has gotten scoping comments, they've gone behind their doors, they've cooked up a draft environmental impact statement, and they put it out to the public for comment. And that in many cases is your last chance to comment, your first and last chance. So that's why you have to be following this process and be prepared. The other thing I want to highlight when I'm talking about this is that the comment process is not a numbers game. It's not like, yay, I'm for this, and boo, I hate it. No, I mean, and understandably, environmental groups, because for their own purposes to encourage membership and involvement, they encourage this kind of formulaic yay, nay kind of commenting. But that's not what the agency is looking for. They're looking for substantive comments. What did they miss? What do you know that they don't know? Do you know of a report or a study that could be helpful? You have that opportunity to add this information so that it influences the final environmental assessment or EIS, and then the agency decision. So smart comments are critical. And then after the NEPA process is done, then some kind of decision document, either a record of decision for an EIS or a decision record in the case of BLM for an EA. Now, one other process that I think is really important and is underutilized, and that is the cooperating agency authority in NEPA. NEPA provides for greater involvement by state and local and tribal governments. They can actually, in some cases, get behind that closed door, work alongside the federal agency as they develop the NEPA document. And that's very powerful. That's one of the things that I look on as something I did as a legacy, was getting BLM to change their rules and make that more, that's okay, and make that more of a requirement than not leave it to the discretion of individual field office managers. So cooperating agency, it's time consuming, it's expensive, but it could be very important for certain types of projects. It's getting your county government involved in the NEPA process. So what are the hurdles to NEPA? Everybody complains about NEPA and the NEPA process, but there's a lot of hurdles that aren't readily apparent. Number one, higher agency priorities. What's the biggest priority at the Forest Service? Fighting fire, preventing fire. Lots of their budget is going to that right now. What's the big priority at Interior? New energy economy. What was the big priority when I was in office? Energy, national energy strategy in the Bush administration, 30 by 30. So there's other priorities, and these agency officials have to respond to their priorities. The other thing, and we heard this from several of the Forest Service speakers, is this lack of capacity. Funding is one thing, funding is a struggle in these land management agencies. They've been going backward for 20 years. And we want more out of our public lands, but there's not the budget and there's not the people, the capacity to engage to the level that we perhaps want. So that is a huge part of that challenge. The other is other federal laws and processes. It goes back to NEPA as an umbrella. Those other laws could hang you up in the NEPA process. Endangered Species Act, for example, could get bogged down in their process. It's a time-sensitive thing. NEPA has no deadlines. I remember one BLM guy said, well, I'm going to do NEPA until it's done. Well, that's not very satisfactory when you're trying to move something along. And, maybe some of you saw this recent announcement about this tie line transmission line that was finally approved. How long did they go through the NEPA process? 15 years. What's happened in our worlds in the last 15 years? A heck of a lot. So NEPA's lack of deadline is a problem. Also lack of page limits. The NEPA regulations, the original, holy writ on NEPA, provided for limitations on page limits, but they are widely ignored. And to me, that's a problem. Remember, NEPA is supposed to be a public participation process. Who has the time to read an 1,000-page NEPA document, or in some cases, tens of thousands of pages? I remember the California Desert Conservation Act. You couldn't even get a printed copy of that. It came in multiple discs. It was so big. Well, who has the time other than somebody who's getting paid by the hour to wade their way through it and read it? So I think NEPA page limits are supportive of public participation, but that's a heavy lift. And and then the last thing, last two things, agencies are always trying to litigation proof NEPA. That's why the NEPA documents get bigger. Oh, we better cover this so we won't get sued. And that's kind of a fool's errand because, like I said, you can win by losing. So what's the harm in filing a lawsuit? And finally, fly specking. All federal courts say, oh, we're not going to fly spec NEPA. Well, but then they get right in and start fly specking. And that means really digging down into smaller issues and second guessing the agency's decision and nitpicking a NEPA document, which is easy to do. NEPA reform is something that people have talked about since the beginning, since the snail darter case. And it's pretty hard to do because what do they call NEPA? The Magna Carta of environmental law. Well, you don't want to touch the Magna Carta. You know, and a recent example is in the Trump administration, they issued new NEPA rules. First time since the rules were issued back in the 70s when NEPA was first enacted. And those rules were litigated and now they're undergoing change by the CEQ in the Biden administration. So it's very hard to do a big, massive fix. But Congress has done strategic targeted NEPA expediting statutes for airports, for highways, and for significant infrastructure in the FAST 41 legislation. But agencies have the authority to create these categorical exclusions if they have the data to support it. And the Forest Service, for example, in 2020, put in place a number of very helpful categorical exclusions for outdoor recreation. So that's worth looking at. Now, just this morning, I woke up, I was reading my news, and there are at least 5 pieces of legislation looking at how to fix the permitting process. You remember this is Senator Manchin's big beef, fix the permitting process. And the Republicans' budget bill has permitting process fixes for fossil fuels. There's other bills that others are moving to fix it for renewable energy. So change may be afoot, we'll see. And so I want to kind of highlight these final things on how do you plan for NEPA success? Go back to the beginning, know and understand your agency, what their mission is, what their constraints are, and what their culture is. Meet with the agency officials. We've heard this before, call them up. They will tell you a lot. I mean, I've made my living calling up federal agency officials. And then when I was a young lawyer, I thought, oh, you know, they're not going to want to talk to me. No, the rule, my experience has been they're very forthcoming, very willing to talk. They do work for the public and they take that seriously. If you can have an opportunity to have a pre-application meeting before you really get your project, you know, really finalized, go in and meet with the agency. Maybe they'll assemble their interdisciplinary team. And that's where they can take kind of a critical look at your project and say, whoa, boy, this is going to create a problem here. Or, whoa, there's a mining claim there. That could be a conflict. And so you can do a little due diligence with the agency. Look for those categorical exclusions, DNAs. Can you do your own NEPA document? Can you somehow come up with the funding and do an applicant prepared EA? Because if you're waiting for the agency to have the funding and the personnel to do your NEPA document, yeah, it's cheaper for you, but it's not fast. And it can be thrown off course by the other priorities we talked about. Think about how you can deconflict the process. Look at those significance factors and those extraordinary circumstances. Do you have any of that in your project? Can you design around it and avoid that? And then just stay informed and don't delay. That's a problem you see a lot. Get involved right away in scoping. Get those issues out at the front. Because by the time the draft comes around, you know, the reality is it's kind of cooked. You know, it's already prepared. The agency has spent a lot of time and money doing that. You can still influence it by public comment, but early is better than late. And then again, prepare meaningful comments and think about whether a cooperating agency might be helpful. I have a degree in library science, so I'm always wanting to give people resources, and these are some resources. The first 3 focus on NEPA if you want to get a deeper dive or have some questions answered, very useful sources. And then the last 3 are more focused on outdoor recreation, how to work with federal agencies. I point out this Ready, Set, Plan. This is something that was developed by Oregon Trails, but it's on the BLM Oregon's website. They give it its stamp of approval. So this is some good information that I think might be helpful. So, well, anyway, where's my horse? So, bottom line, there's a lot of opportunity on federal lands. NEPA is a challenge. It's a mysterious law in many ways. It's hard to get your hands around it, amorphous. but it's a process. And if you think about it as a process, and get involved in the process to make it better, it can really result in a durable decision, something that will last for time. And then I would just add my voice to what we heard in the first 2 days of the conference. It's really important that outdoor recreation in Wyoming have knowledgeable advocates. I was following the outdoor recreation bills in the legislature this year, and these legislators, as Representative Newsom said yesterday, they need to hear from you now. When you go back, talk to them about why it's important for the community to have outdoor recreation, how it helps support economic development. Provide them data and facts. It doesn't have to be confrontational. Give them information they may not have inside their bubble. So I think that's an important role, and that's what I'll leave you with. So if you have any questions,